Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Despite President Bashar al-Assad's offer to open a national dialogue and grant a broad amnesty in a speech a few days ago, the protests and the brutal repression that have engulfed Syria since March are continuing unabated. As the regime becomes increasingly isolated on the international scene, many fear Syria is headed for an Iraqi-style sectarian civil war. With me today is a rarity in a country where foreign media are tightly restricted, someone who has his ear to the ground in Syria since he's based in Damascus, Peter Harling, who is a senior analyst with the Middle East program of the International Crisis Group. Welcome to the France 24 interview. Bring us your impression of what is happening in Syria in the last few weeks.
Well, perhaps I'd start with a word of caution. It's extremely difficult, I think, to comment on the daily events in Syria as they unravel. The situation remains extremely opaque for lack of access. And although I am based in Damascus, Damascus is a bit of a bubble. It's a city which has fallen into a state of confusion, and Syrians themselves in Damascus find it difficult to form a clear opinion of what is going on in the country. They tend to distrust what they hear from the official media in Syria, but also I think they've learned to distrust some of the reporting coming from the mainstream international media, and the internet itself has its shortcomings. So I'd start off with a word of caution. I think it's quite necessary.
Just for Damascus, where are you based? I mean, what's the situation there in the capital?
Well, basically, you have three kinds of situations in Syria right now. Damascus, as I said, is in a state of confusion. The biggest city in the country, Aleppo, in the north, is in a state of denial to a large extent. It's a country which it's a city, sorry, which didn't fully understand the depth of the crisis. People rejected even the notion that a serious crisis was occurring in the country. But in many other parts of Syria, people have come to conclusions. They've seen what's left of the security, the regime's presence on the ground, which is the security services, which are behaving in dismal ways in many cases, using excessive force to repress the protest movement. And although there might be armed elements within the protest movement, it is massively an indigenous, spontaneous, and peaceful protest movement, which these security services are repressing forcefully. So in all these parts of the country where demonstrations have taken place, I think people have come to conclusions. There's no denial or confusion there.
What are their conclusions? The regime must disappear.
Well, what they've seen of the regime is something which they hadn't seen in years. It goes back basically to the aftermath of the great repression that took place in the early 80s, at a time when the security services in a sense profited from the crisis and took considerable importance within the power structure and basically erected a wall of fear in the country. Right now, in much of the provinces, the regime is not represented anymore by the Ba'ath Party, which is very much an empty shell. It's not represented by the local administration, which has fallen apart in many cases. So what's left really is the security services on the ground resorting to methods Syrians hadn't seen in a very long time. So any talk of a reformist outlook, of progress to come in the capital is to a large extent irrelevant to people who have witnessed a rather dramatic regression on the contrary, on the ground.
But why has this happened? There are many questions around Bashar al-Assad. Is he hostage to hardliners, or is this his decision to crack down on the repression, open a dialogue, but at the same time have his troops shoot on protesters?
Well, it's hard to tell what's going on within the inner circle. There's a lot of speculation and rumors, and I wouldn't like to go that way. But for one thing, Bashar al-Assad is the leader of this country. He is a statesman, and I think bears responsibility as a result for what is going on the ground, whether he actually ordered the crackdown or not. I think here there's a lot of frustration and disappointment within Syria. He was seen very much as an individual who could, in a sense, side with society against the regime, against the darker aspects of the regime. He inherited a regime from his father which was much tougher than the regime was before the onset of this crisis. He dismantled many of the darker facets of the regime he inherited. What we've seen over the past 3 months is a revival precisely of that regime, that loathed regime which many Syrians don't want to see come back.
And how do you explain that? Is it to avoid what happened in Tunisia, in Egypt, or and go more the Gaddafi way, if I may say?
I'm not sure it's the result of a clear policy, decision-making process, or vision on the part of the leadership. What we see is the regime behaving in rather erratic, chaotic ways on all fronts, in terms of repression, in terms of reform, in terms of engaging in a dialogue with the opposition or the protest movement, in terms of handling the consequences of this crisis on the economy too. So I think the trends we see in Syria are very much a result of the aggregation of individual behaviors rather than the product of a clear strategy in terms of dealing with this crisis.
The international community is crying wolf. It says Bashar al-Assad is really an ugly dictator now, but they don't really know what to do. And the argument often heard in the West is, oh, Syria is really fragile. There are many different religions, sects, and so on. So there could be a risk that it could be an Iraq back to the years 2004, 2005, kind of civil war, sectarian civil war. Is this a real threat in Syria?
Well, the international community as a whole has been very ambivalent when it comes to Syria. I think Syrian foreign policy was seen as an irritant by many countries across the world, Israel, the US, and some in Europe and the Arab world. So I think there was this temptation, I think, to see the regime not necessarily collapse, but come out of this crisis weaker, and a regime that, as a result, could be pressured into making the kind of concessions that it didn't want to make in the past. That's one aspect, I think, of the international community's posture. There also is a lot of anxiety in terms of the possible breakup of Syrian society. There also is a realization that the international community has very few levers of pressure over a regime which has never really responded to pressure in terms of sanctions or resolutions from the United Nations Security Council, for example. Sorry.
No, I want to talk about the risk of a civil war, sectarian civil war. Is this for real?
Well, there's been a tremendous amount of focus in the mainstream media on sectarianism and the prospects of civil war in Syria, and I think that is regrettable. Syria
because it's wrong?
It's not necessarily wrong, but it's not a given either. And I think that there is this perception that as a result of the makeup of Syrian society, it can only repeat the Iraqi model. And here I'd like to stress that civil war in Iraq didn't break out spontaneously as a result of deep trends within Iraqi society. I mean, sectarianism runs deep in Iraq as it does in Syria and throughout much of the region. But very little violence occurred in Iraq when the regime collapsed, although the state had been gutted by the embargo and by the looting in the aftermath of the US invasion. And although the regime in Iraq had committed horrendous crimes which could have justified some sectarian retribution, no violence, sectarian violence occurred before the spring 2004, a full year after the regime's collapse. And the civil war really broke out in 2006 as a result of policies decreed by the US and returning exiles far more than spontaneous behavior within society. Well, there is again, it's not a given, it's not something which we can exclude, but I think we need to give this society a chance. It's a society which is doesn't have a sense of self-confidence. They saw what happened in Lebanon and during the civil war there. They saw what happened in Iraq. They're worried at what they see in Libya, for example, Yemen. But still, I think they deserve a chance. They deserve a chance.
But Bashar al-Assad still deserves a chance to conduct a reform. In the eyes of many, he does not.
I was talking about the fact that Syrian society is not doomed, is not condemned to civil war. I don't see it. When it comes to the legitimacy of the regime, I think this is very much up to the Syrians themselves to decide. I think it's a mistake on the part of Western governments to decide that the Syrian regime is illegitimate or not. I think this really depends very much on the protest movement on the ground, reaching the critical mass that would demonstrate once and for all that the regime is indeed illegitimate.
Last question. Does the regime have an exit strategy? I read somewhere about collective suicide, and I mean, do they know what they're doing and where they're going?
Well, they don't give that sense, and I think that's what hurts most at this time. The regime has rallied significant support within three constituencies, basically, of late. The minorities, who fear this, hegemonic Sunni Islamist agenda if the regime was to fall. They fear that the fragile secular model in Syria would fall along with the regime. The middle class, the middle class fate is very much tied to the kind of state which emerged under this regime. And finally, the business establishment wants to protect its interests. But none of these three constituencies see the regime fleshing out a clear exit for this crisis, although it's already been 3 months and the crisis has had dramatic impact on the economy and increasingly threatens the country, indeed, of a breakup.
Okay. Peter Harling, we'll see how the events unfold in Syria. Thank you very much for coming on the France 24 interview. Thank you all for watching it, and stay tuned for more news here on France 24.